Hello and good day. This is The Channeled Truth. I'm your host, Thomas Leichardt, and I'm a channeler myself, and I love exploring the works of Seth and Jane Roberts, Bashar, and Abraham-Hicks. And with me today, we have a very special guest who is also incredibly well-versed in these three channelers, has been exploring the materials for many, many years, and in fact, he's written a book with the title of Seth, Abraham, Bashar, All That You See Is Yourself. Now, the title is very interesting because it leads us into the topic for today, which is the idea that physical reality is reflective in nature. And I know Richard has some thoughts that he's been gathering about this that he's really passionate to share with us. So, Richard, go ahead. I'm going to let you just take it away with the opening comments. So go ahead and run with it.
Yeah, I decided really to write that book, Seth, Abraham, Bashar, because I was interested in the comparisons. And I came across Seth first, and then I came across Abraham, and actually came across Bashar much later. But there was so much continuity between what they were saying that I just thought I need to just compare them and look at what they're doing. And in terms of the title, All That You See Is Yourself, it was really came out of my reasoning about the reality that we perceive. Most people are thinking that the world is coming at them, and actually that they are sort of beholden to anything and events that happen around them, without realizing that actually what they're experiencing is put out from their self, from their own subconscious and their own thoughts and beliefs. And that physical reality is actually feedback at an individual level almost. And in fact, Bashar is one of the first to say that, you all live on your own worlds, that you don't actually share the same world. And then you get someone like Seth who says that a lot of our interactions are through telepathic communication. So that when I'm talking to someone in front of me and they're talking back to me, they're actually creating a version of myself that they're creating telepathically initially. So then they see a version of what they have created. So it was another thing that was interesting for me, this idea that how can you tell what people, how people see you? Are people seeing the same me that I'm seeing in the mirror? There used to be an old thing where they used to say, oh, the photograph never lies. And of course, in contemporary modern times, we know that you can edit a photo and it can lie. But I actually wonder, if you just take an ordinary photograph, is that really as close as you'll get to the way someone might see you? But what if I actually look like a reptile to somebody? I wouldn't really know if that was their perception of what a human was. So I got into this whole dilemma about, what is our physical feedback and how does that relate to other people?
Yeah, that's a really powerful point in all these spiritual teachings. Seth came in first with this whole idea of you create your own reality, right? And Bashar comes out with what you put out is what you get back. Abraham-Hicks very much in alignment with that as well. And it's very powerful because, at first it's a little disturbing that these events that are materializing, I had a hand in them, right? But then you realize it's incredibly liberating because it's if I had a hand in creating them, well, then I can change this reality, right? I have the power. The power is within me, rather than it's, as you said, happening from the outside and the world is coming at me, right? Seeing it as a reflection, you can work with that, right? Because what you put out is what you get back, and that begs the question, well, what am I putting out? Am I putting out the love frequency, or am I putting out, disconnection or feeling a lack of self-value, self-worth, right? So all of that. But to riff a little bit on your other comment, the whole idea of the shared reality, because you kind of brought that in sideways. I really love what Bashar says. He says it's this and that, right? So we each live in our own universal bubble, but at the same time, we create a consensus, like you said, through telepathy, as Bashar says, telepathy, right? We have this shared agreement, but we're also living each in our own universe, and it's this and that, right? And it takes some time to meditate with that and to sit with that. But the power, truthfully, it always comes back to us, right? Because we come back to that fundamental principle: what you put out is what you get back. And this has been said, the parable, it's like the reaping and sowing idea, what you sow, you reap what you sow. It's an ancient idea, right? So a lot of these channelers, they come in and they refresh some of that ancient knowledge that is within us, down to our DNA, right? We know it to be true. That's why we love reading these materials. So yeah, thank you for that. I just wanted to riff on that a little bit.
Yeah. And I suppose, that historically, like you say, we get this information throughout history, but it seems that we almost have to relearn it or re-understand what it is that they're saying. And of course, in contemporary times, we often say these sort of what I used to term the wise sayings, and they all sound very good and everyone gives you lots of likes, but they don't necessarily really think about it or understand what it is that is being said there. And therefore we often need either someone else saying it in a different way, or we have to, sort of resonate in a different way with other people, and give other examples and analogies to express what that means. I think that's the other thing that all the channels have said in varying ways. I'm not sure to what extent Seth is very fond of using the term frequency, but I know Bashar and Abraham often talk about, you have to be in the right frequency. You can't actually be in the frequency that you're not if you're trying to find something that isn't you. You almost have to be what it is you're looking for in order to actually materialize it.
Yeah.
And I think that's another interesting thing about, we often say, oh, well, why does it take so long to manifest something that we want? And of course, Abraham would say, well, you've got 17 seconds to change your mind before law of attraction kicks in. And of course, there were other films like What the Beep Do and We Know, and in America, I think they've got one called The Leap, or it's just called Leap. And they look at this idea that if you were suddenly to materialize things instantly, with our level of consciousness and our inability to focus to the exclusion of other things, we could really get into some trouble and difficulty. So it is quite useful having a kind of a linear experience in a spacious present, for that reason, that we have time to consider, well, do I really want that? And now, once you make that decision, getting the passion and the expectation, going so that you can draw it and create it in your reality. So there's quite a process to go through.
Yeah, I agree. The time lag is actually super useful, and it's just inherent in the game of physical reality, so that we have that pause of reflection, right? This is something Barry Gellis was actually talking about in the last episode, right? You have this moment of pause. And the paradox is we're actually creating instantaneously all the time because we don't have gaps in our reality, right? But we have this sense of a built-in time lag, right? That things, quote unquote, take time to manifest. And so we're playing with this idea of continuity within the framework of actually instant manifestation, because like I said, there's no gaps to reality. Reality is always there. So the manifestation is happening in each instant, right? But we're building into it this sense of a time loop, right? Where it takes, quote unquote, time for things to manifest. And I love this idea of paradox, right? Bashar really loves playing with paradox, and he really gets into it's this and that, right? Instead of seeing it as this or that. But yeah, oftentimes we get caught into this, oh, I want that thing, right? And the thing about understanding frequency, and sometimes when people say, well, why does it take so much time to manifest that? Well, oftentimes it's because they're not a frequency match to that, right? Bashar likes to say, you cannot see what you're not the vibration of. That's the idea, is cultivating through that reflective mirror and making those adjustments, right? And realizing that, if you're getting a certain reality, you can shift that frequency and use the reflective reality, the reflective mirror of physical reality, to constantly adjust that frequency, to use that feedback in a positive way.
And of course, one of the things that Bashar has said about this is that, we do a lot of things habitually and by default, and which is really what you were saying a minute ago, that we're actually creating all the time, and we're actually creating our environment constantly all the time. But by default, So we're not really having to think about it in the same way that we're not having to think, oh, I must keep my heart moving. I must keep making sure that all these things are happening around my body in order for me to be able to survive and carry on. We don't think about it. We don't need to, because that consciousness that is, perhaps in the inner self that we're not always in contact with is quite happy getting on with it. And so when we actually decide then we recognize that some of our behavior is habitual, and Bashar would say, once a habit is recognized, it's not a habit, it's a choice. And I think that we're making a lot more choices now, that we're having more understanding, and there's more of this metaphysical data and information about. And certainly there are a lot more people now channeling. I mean, yourself included. And so there's a lot of information we can tune into, and it's becoming much more worldly. That a lot of people now, this is perhaps moving towards this other level of consciousness now that everyone's talking about again, sort of this fifth dimensional thing.
Yes.
And it's really just a heightened awareness, so that more and more people are actually gaining their own understanding. And things like the COVID outbreak, Seth would say, was a physical manifestation of a symbolism for our conditions. And he often talks about the symbols of things, and they become manifest as physical feedback, and that we have to recognize what is that symbolic of.
Right.
And I think certainly in some of the COVID time, a lot of people who perhaps hadn't taken the time to reflect suddenly found that they had the time, and they were forced into reflection to really think, well, what is it all about? It must be more to the life that I'm experiencing than just going out with the job that I've got. And, I think people have started to reevaluate, and therefore they can observe now the physical feedback around the world. What is it saying? What is it symbolic of?
Yes. I agree with all of that. And we're moving into times where, like Bashar said, it's not a habit. Once you recognize it, it's a choice, right? Where we're becoming more conscious of the realities that we're creating, right? Rather than creating by default, we're starting to recognize, well, how do I have a hand in this, right? The famous or the very useful tool from Bashar and from Seth is, what would I have to believe is true about myself to be thinking these thoughts, to be, feeling these feelings, to be manifesting these behaviors, and to be getting this reality reflection, right? What would I have to believe is true about myself in this situation to be thinking this way, feeling this way, acting this way, getting this reality reflection, right? It's such a powerful, powerful question. And the times, they are changing, right? And like you said, and Bashar has said this too, the whole COVID experience was almost like a forced monastic experience, a pause, a deeply, deeply needed pause of reflection for Western civilization, so that people can ask those deeper questions like, what is this? What does this all mean? And do I really want to continue? Do I want to go back to the life that I had prior to COVID? Or do I need to reevaluate some things? Do I want to put out some different energy? Are there certain passions I've put up, to the side because, the whole responsibility, the work, the treadmill, the bills to pay, and blah, blah, the whole thing, right? Pause for reflection. I think that's just something that's really powerful. And a lot of these channeled entities, they give us that moment of reflection. What reality am I creating, right? Take the power back into yourself and start realizing that you have the power of curiosity, asking that question. What would I have to believe is true about myself in this situation to be getting this reality, right? And what you put out is what you get back, right? So what frequency do I want to put out? Do I want to constantly go into knee-jerk reaction? A sense of withdrawal, maybe a sense of getting back at somebody, a sense of revenge in subtle ways or overt ways, right? Or do I want to put out the love frequency regardless of what other people do, because it feels darn good to be in the love frequency, right? This is something that Abraham-Hicks really hammers in, is feeling good, right? I think they kind of lead in with that. Seth is a little bit more like, you create your own reality and here's the nuts and bolts of it. Bashar is more like, roll your sleeves up and act on your passion, to the
Yeah.
best of your ability with
I
no.
mean, interestingly, that's what I was thinking of coming on to. Actually, you've introduced that quite nicely about this sense of joy. And all the channels talk about this expressing joy, and that's what we're really seeking, this feeling of joy. And if you can attain a feeling of joy in as many things that you do as possible without concern for other things, then you're on the right path.
Yes, yes, yes. But it's so important to recognize your definitions, because when you say, "Oh, act on your joy, act on your passion to the exclusion of everything else," people start freaking out. Well, what if you're a murderous, villain and your joy is in killing people? So we have to define this as joy is the pure translation of your higher dimensional self into 3D, into third dimensional terms. That definition cannot contain harming others. It's by definition, right? So when you act on your joy and your passion, we're talking about that pure translation of soul energy into physical terms. And that just by default is in integrity, right? And in alignment with all that is, right? So the definitions are super, super important here. But
and of
yeah.
course, I mean, Seth says quite clearly that, to consciously want to harm something else is not helpful to us. And so he extends that not just with each other as people, but even in the smallest insects. If you go out with the intention to hurt it or harm it, I mean, obviously we still have accidents where you might squash something by accident, but I think really he's talking about, the intention behind our actions, that it's not helpful to have that kind of approach, even though nothing really kind of dies in a way. But he does say that, as in terms of our own personality, it is much more beneficial to us to, I suppose, act in a more positive and beneficial way for others as well as ourselves. And that, I suppose, comes back to, the service in some way to others and not just thinking about ourselves. Although Abraham, of course, says it's right to be selfish, but they don't think of it in our traditional way of selfish. They're really something, when you can really help yourself, you're helping everybody else.
Absolutely.
You're the best self that you can be.
I believe absolutely that joy carries the frequency of harmony with it, right? Because it's the pure joy of co-creation is sharing it with others and uplifting others while being uplifted by them, right? It's that pure state of harmony and being your most authentic self, which is the most unique and the most beneficial contribution you can make to the whole, right? In musical terms, you play your own instrument, you play your own tune, and this is where Abraham goes in. Yeah, be selfish in the sense of be your truest, most natural self. Be that true self, because that's the best way you fit into the symphony. It's built into the system that way, right? So when you activate that pure joy frequency, that's the precise note that is going to be the most uplifting for all your fellow beings, right?
In fact, you would be attracting people of that vibration into your experience as well. So your feedback would be losing some people and gaining others, because, if you're wanting to raise, metaphorically speaking, your level of vibration in some way, then you also will attract similar people and feedback. And this is why coming back to that idea of the knee-jerk reaction, and of course family and other people can easily push our buttons, as it were, and we can respond in a way we've always responded. But if you actually take a moment when those things happen to sort of say, well, what is it within me that I'm putting something out that is actually it's producing them to feed back to me in a particular way. Now, if I were to have a different approach, then their feedback would be different. This actually, interestingly, is the sort of essence of something else that we don't really talk about, which is the Hawaiian Ho'oponopono. But of course, it does fit very well with what we're told by Seth, Abraham, and Bashar. It's just that it comes under a different name, and they take a slightly different approach. But this idea of asking yourself the question, what is it within me that is creating this situation that I'm experiencing? And I think the channels would probably go along with that as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I love what you mentioned about family, right? Because it reminds me of something Ram Dass is famous for saying: if you think you're so enlightened, go spend a week with your family, right? And I love that because, that's where our families of origin, that's where a lot of these layers and filters and straitjackets and negative beliefs, come from, so to speak, right, in linear terms, right? And the idea is what Bashar says is so beautiful. It's not the recognition of change, that you yourself have changed, is not based on the outside changing, but it's based on your response changing, even when the outside looks the same. And that is so powerful, right? Because sometimes we get caught into this like, oh, I'm putting out the love frequency, therefore, oh, my brother should treat me differently, and my mother should, and my father, the family of origin, siblings, they should treat me differently now, right? But they're not. Like, oh my God, I'm doing something, you know what I mean? But Bashar kind of cuts through all that and says, put out the love frequency, right? Or put out the energy that you want. And if you can continue to put it out, even when people around you, it doesn't have to be family, it can be boss, it can be, spouse, whatever, right? Are still treating you in a negative way, but you can maintain that frequency, that's when you know you've changed. And that's when the capacity of for the external reflection to change greatly amplifies, because it no longer needs to demonstrate that to you. You don't have to it's like you don't require that challenge anymore, right?
But it is quite challenging to begin that change. Our knee-jerk reactions and our habits are quite entrenched in us, and it's very easy to go back into something. I mean, it's sort of a bit like when people have actually perhaps given up drugs or drink or whatever, and in the place that they've had their rehab or whatever, they seem to think, it seems okay, but then they go back to where this all started. They go back to their environment, and it triggers that response that's always been triggered. You can actually create your own habits. If I actually decided to do something particular in a particular room in my house, and I made it into a habit, I would then find that when I go back into that room after a month of doing the habit, that I would find it quite difficult to behave in a different way. And it's something that we're really having to change our behavior in the present moment to affect what's coming in our next immediate future. Because in a way, what we're experiencing now is a kind of a past, because this that we're experiencing now is what we've actually created up to this point. So therefore, we can actually become quite confused by our creation and our feedback, which is taking us back to the beginning of this. The feedback that's coming back at us, we kind of think, oh, well, that's in the present and I can't do anything about it. So you then react to that feedback. But what you have to do is actually react differently and plant the seed of, what's going to happen next, as opposed to what I'm experiencing now.
Yes.
And the more you try that, I mean, I tried it originally with my own daughter when she was sort of 13 or 14. And a lot of teenagers will go through what we would deem to be fairly irrational, things that they say, that, she's upset about something and she's aiming it at me. And actually, it's not making any real sense. There's no continuity in what she's saying, but it pushes the buttons and you feedback in a particular way. But actually, if you just let her say those things and you don't try and say anything against it, it becomes easier. So the next time the thing happens, it may not happen another time because you've taken that sting out of it. You've changed the reality. So she doesn't even say those things the next time. If you see what I mean, it changes her behavior towards me because I've changed my behavior towards her.
Correct.
But not necessarily in the way that we think in a rational world. It's because I've vibrationally changed. I've reacted differently to what I perceived as her behavior. But obviously something in me caused her to behave in that way towards me, to give me feedback. And this is why it comes back to, all that you see is yourself.
Yeah, and you've given her different feedback, which means now she has a different reality to respond to, right? So it shifts. Yeah, it's like in concentric circle, it vibrates out from us, and then what we put out is what we get back, right? But this really harkens back to what you mentioned and what Bashar said, right? That the whole idea of a habit, right? It's like, yes, there's a kind of momentum, right? And that's what you're speaking of, is we built up this sense of momentum through continuity and time and the feedback loops. But the truth is, as what Bashar says, when we make a move, right, we make an action, it's a choice, right? A habit is something you don't know you're doing, right? But once you start seeing yourself, I'm doing this, now it's a choice. And now you can work with that, because you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to believe is true about myself in this situation to choose this action, behavior, right? These feelings. And you start unpacking that, and then you start realizing, well, it's nonsensical, right? Well, why is it that when I want to have a heartfelt connection with my daughter, I'm going to respond in a negative way to her negative comment, right? When all that gets me is more negativity, right? So at some point you realize, like, that doesn't make sense anymore, right? So I'm going to respond in a different way. Let me make another choice. Let me shift the frequency, or let me put out something different, right? And it's powerful, right? It's like, Bashar says you've changed when your response to conditions that even look the same, your response is different, right? That's when you know you've changed. But the paradox is that as soon as we respond differently, even though the outside looks the same, that's when it has the greatest capacity to change, right? Because we've given up our need for it to change, right? And I love that paradox of these teachings.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like Seth talks about having a nonchalant attitude towards the things that you want to change. And I think he also says it's either Seth or Bashar or both that say, for a while there may be a slight drag in things changing, but don't be unduly concerned about that, and sure enough, things will change. And I think sometimes when we think, oh well, I've just changed my attitude, why isn't it working? It's not really happening. That we have to change in more ways than just one time, really, of doing something differently. Again, it comes back to our nature, our habitual nature, really. To shift that and actually form a new habit, to actually recognize that we're behaving in a particular way and actually make a decision to actually behave in a different way. And that is quite, it's not easy at first when you're trying this out. And I think people can easily give up and fall back into their default behavior again.
Well, the beauty of it is when your response changes regardless of what the other person does, you're free. And it's like you were saying earlier, vibration is a filtering device, right? And so people will naturally filter out. If they want to continue being negative and just spit out negativity, and you've shifted to positive and you just keep responding positively, well, eventually they'll either shift to match your vibration, and that might take time, right? And everyone has their own timing. But maybe they're not ready to shift, right? Maybe they'll start shifting out of your reality because it's not a match. There's no dance anymore, right? Your frequency's shifted to another place. They're unwilling. Likewise, if we stay stuck in negativity, it's the same thing, right? We stay stuck in negativity, somebody else shifts to a positive frame, and it's like the dance can't happen anymore, right? And we might wake up at that point and be like, oh, I want to shift my frequency. This is really important to me to have this co-creation, right? Or you might not be ready for that. Maybe the blinders are on too strong, right? So it's a natural filtration device, frequency, it's frequency matching, but it's also like, is there a dance between these two individuals? So when you remove your negative part of the dance, then, the old saying goes, it takes two to tango, right?
Yes, yeah. I think the other thing is that we don't always know the choices that people have made within themselves or before they incarnated in this particular realm. There may be certain conflicts that they need to work out in a different way. We might be ready to solved it, but perhaps they aren't. But they perhaps also at the same time need that seed planting that, later on they could actually come back to it in some form and actually say, oh yes, I remember someone said something about this, and maybe I could use that. But at that moment they may not be ready, or that there's actually something else that they need to experience in conflicts, and we might almost help to take that away from them. In some small measure.
Yeah, the challenge sometimes is actually when you do realize that it's an incompatible frequency match at that point, And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to remove yourself from a situation and no longer enable someone to continue in a negative pattern. And that gives them an opportunity to change, right? Or to experience the consequences of those states, that it means there's no longer a dance, no longer a co-creation, right? So sometimes, yeah, that comes into play. And sometimes we're the ones being left, quote unquote, behind in our negative states, right? It's like, I always want to present both sides, because sometimes I'm the one with the blinders on, and that's the humility of this path, right? Is, I'm not an ascended master by any stretch, right? I'm dealing with my own blockages and my limitations, just like everybody else, using this material as best as I can. And sometimes the blinders are on, and sometimes you're the slower one, or I'm the slower one. And that's the beauty of this dance, is we're all in this together and helping each other transform great darkness to light and limitation to freedom, right?
Sometimes though, you kind of think, oh yes, I think I'm getting it. I think I've sorted it out now. And the universe kind of throws you a curveball and you suddenly think, oh no, back to the drawing board. You kind of feel sometimes that you're somewhere where you're not. But I think that's the great thing about, you talked earlier about this idea of, I used to call it contradiction, paradox, I think you said. And I learned quite a long time before I came across Seth, because I was also followed Ram Dass and people like Krishnamurti. And one of my favorite things of Ram Dass was that you said that his whole life up to that point had been somebody training, and the suit didn't really fit anymore. But it was a case of, you do without doing, be without being, see without seeing, hear without hearing it. You come across these paradoxes. I came across them quite early on. I don't sort of feel them in the same way now, because I perhaps don't need to kind of see it that way now. I just work through it. I'm aware of it, but I don't necessarily have to go through them all. How a bit like when you're changing a gear shift or something in a manual car, you're thinking about everything and trying to get it right when you're starting out, but eventually you don't need to think about it, you just do it. And I think some of these paradoxes, rather than sort of thinking, oh, what does that mean, or I worried about it, you kind of think, oh, it's one of those paradoxes again.
Yes. And you use the tool as you understand it, versus trying to figure out like, oh, is the tool going to work, or why does it work, or what are the inner mechanics of it, which is all well and good. But I think, to your point, the beauty of this path is it does become easier. It's like the analogy of learning to drive stick, right? It's a good one, right? At first you're kind of thinking over everything, overthinking, and your timing's off or whatever. And then after a while you start getting the hang of it. It's just like, oh, I hit a wall. Oh, I have this incredible negative feeling. Oh, I have tools for that. Oh, let me unpack this. Let me ask that pertinent question. What would I have to believe is true, right? Let me dig in here, right? Whereas before it was like, oh, pile on the negativity. Oh, I'm a schmuck for behaving that way. Oh, let's beat myself up, and then it's like you just spiral down into the pit. Now it's like, oh, I behaved in a negative way. Let me love myself, because there's a part of me that's hurting inside, right? What a fundamental shift, right? And then in that love frequency, I can start really unpacking to, what is the unconscious choice here, right? So that it isn't a habit anymore. It becomes a choice, and I lovingly investigate, well, what's going on, and what are the hurts behind it? What are the projections, right? And you can melt through that so much faster in love than when I used to beat myself up for, oh my God, I can't believe I behaved that way. Oh, what a schmuck, you know what I mean? And it's like you pile it on. So yeah, it's beautiful to have the capacity to engage these tools, and it's more reflexive. It's more just the way we live our lives, right?
I think we don't necessarily manage to do all of it at once either.
Of course.
I mean, you find one aspect that you suddenly really understand, and it's almost like you kind of say to yourself, well, this is easy. Why difficult? There's actually nothing to it. And yet you could have another bit of your life that's similar but different that you're still struggling with. And if you could just apply the same sort of awareness or something to that, But it's almost like you see it, you're seeing something the same as something that's different, and it's not in a way.
Well, I'm just going to make one closing comment because we're coming up on time here. But the idea is as you continually raise your frequency, also you recognize that there are parts of your life that you'll no longer tolerate, that you used to tolerate in the old frequency, right? So it's like there's constantly the next blind spot, right? It's like because you're refining and refining, and the higher you go in frequency, the more aware you become of the places that you're still tethered to the old realities, right? So it never ends, right? And that's the beauty of it. We're just spiraling up, and each iteration of moving up in the spiral, we recognize, oh, here's some other tethers that I didn't notice before because I wasn't this high before in frequency, right? But we're coming to the end here, so I actually just wanted to invite you to invite our guests to how to find you, right? Is there a place they can find you, or a go-to place they can learn more about your books and your
I think
teachings? Or
these days, probably the best place to find me is my metaphysical website, which I've put a lot of varied information on, a lot of Seth Abraham-Bashar stuff, plus a lot of other people who resonate with the same ideas. And it's called Kiku, which is KEEKOO, and it's a .co.uk. If you put Richard Gentle into a search engine, you'll probably find me there as well. And most roads lead back to the sites that I have. And even on richardgentle.com, there's a link to Kiku on there. So there are various ways you can find me. And also the books that I've written are also on that site as well.
great. Well, thank you, Richard. I just want to add, I actually read your Seth Abraham-Bashar book over the weekend, and it was a really great read and a great summary of all these channeled materials. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
thank you
thanks.
for being on the show. We'll definitely have you on again. And for our viewers out there, may this inspire you to really go deep into who you truly are and find that joy frequency, find that love frequency, and begin to express it in all you do. And may you use all these shows and all these channeled materials for your benefit, for the upliftment of you, which is also naturally the upliftment of the world, right? So with that, we're going to sign off, and we will wish you a beautiful, loving, and a fond good day.